I live in a small southern town built on 7 hills at the confluence of 3 rivers with Cherokee Indian names, the Etowah, the Coosa, and the Ustanola. Our town is named for the great city at the heart of classical civilization and at the crossroads of Christendom, Rome. In front of our little town hall, with its white Corinthian columns, stands a reproduction of the famous statue of Romulus and Remus being suckled by a wolf, the gift of Il Duce, Benito Mussolini. It disappeared shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, but reappeared several years ago, quietly, without fanfare. There must be 30 Baptist churches in our town, and almost as many Pentecostal churches, many of them tiny, scattered everywhere, like Greek chapels in the mountains, and some of them are almost as picturesque. One of them made the news lately when its preacher was bitten by the rattlesnakes he was handling. Also of Methodist churches, and Churches of Christ, and Presbyterian churches. There is a venerable stone Episcopal church with lovely stained glass windows, and a hugely popular Catholic church with a crowded Spanish Mass every Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock. There's even a small synagogue and a Hebrew cemetery, but not a single Lutheran church. On Thursday evenings, I teach a Bible study at a local prison holding roughly 2,000 inmates. Last Thursday night, I was assigned cell block T2. 23 men of mixed races and ages live there in a large, windowless room with concrete walls. 51 of them profess to be Christians. They bring their Bibles, eager to begin. We start by holding hands in a circle and saying the Lord's Prayer together. Every man prays. From the Old Testament, we read about Nathan's condemnation of David's clever murder of Uriah the Hittite and of David's repentance. From the New Testament, we read Luke's account of a notoriously sinful woman who washes Jesus' feet with her tears and dries them with her hair. Another story of repentance and forgiveness. After an hour, or I should add that these men that I'm with, they too are eager to repent, and they're aching for forgiveness. After an hour, we return to our prayer circle, and a young black man named Alvin leads us in a benediction, so Christly, so faithful, so tender toward every man in cell block T2 that I must fight back my own tears. We embrace one another, and I press the buzzer to be let out. What's wrong with this picture? Why are so many of our Christian brothers in prison? Now perhaps some of you are thinking, this is an odd way to begin to talk about classical Christian education. And to be odd, I believe the answer to these questions, as well as the answer to so many other troubling questions we might ask about what is happening to the Christian church in America these days, has a great deal to do with classical Christian education. I hope this will become apparent as we examine what classical Christian education is, or should be, all about. But before that, I'd like to remind you of a powerful idea both the pagans and the Christians of the ancient world shared. This is the idea that the mind is a microcosmos, a microcosm of the universe. It was an axiom of Stoicism that the logos of both the individual and the universe are one and the same. The goal of a Stoic, like Seneca or Epictetus, was to bring his mind into conformity with nature, with the immutable order and law of the universe. The Christians, most of them converts from paganism, grasped immediately St. John's reference to Christ as the Logos, and knew precisely what St. Paul wanted when he urged them to take on the mind of Christ. Now, the influence of the world and the mind runs both ways. The world ultimately reflects the minds of those who inhabit it. This is the core idea that I want to build my talk with you around. this mutual influence of the world and the mind. The world ultimately reflects the minds of those who inhabit it. At one level, think of the farmer whose lands will reflect his knowledge of agriculture, his love of the soil, his aesthetic sensibilities, his work ethic, his priorities, even his faith in Christ's redemptive work for all God's creation. At another level, think of the film director whose work will also reflect what is in his mind, his knowledge of his craft, his taste in art, his regard for and responsibility to his audience, his convictions about right and wrong, his reasons for directing films, his belief in Christ's lordship over all of life, and so on. At the same time, our minds mirror the world we inhabit. At the same time as the world influences our minds mirror the world we inhabit. Children raised by abusive parents are more likely to become abusive parents and violent people. Children raised by God-fearing parents are more likely to fear God and keep His commandments. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Romantics, imbued with an idealized concept of nature, ran with this notion and declared education a bad thing and wanted the mind to mirror nature unaided and unadorned. We smile at their naivete. Not only do we reject their idealized concept of nature, but we recognize that education, or as the Greeks would have called it, paideia, is all around us. It is unavoidable. We swim in it. It is nothing less than the world. The world will leak into the mind, no matter how tightly we strive to seal ourselves off from it. In Genesis, God intentionally leaves His magnificent act of creation incomplete, and He commands and empowers us to complete His creation with the words, "Be fruitful and increase, fill the earth and subdue it." He gave this command, of course, in the context of human innocence and natural perfection. The context changed dramatically after Adam and Eve sinned, and it was inevitable that the human mind, corrupted by disobedience, would botch the job of completing creation. Set up a vicious cycle that runs throughout human history. Not only the creators of a botched world, we are its victims as well. Political divide in America is partly determined by a point of emphasis, with conservatives focusing on the mind's influence on the world and liberals focusing on the world's influence on the mind. We would do well as educators to remember both. To understand why so many Christian men and women are in prison, why so many children raised in Christian homes are rebelling against their parents, why so many Christian marriages are ending in divorce, and why so many Christians are mired in depression, perversion, addiction, materialism, and other forms of sinful self-absorption. One has only to consider the influence of the world on the mind, and what is as important, the failure of the Christian mind to influence the world. Christians in America live in a society committed to expelling God from the world. Our government, particularly the judiciary, is firmly resolved to ban any form of religious symbol or observance from our public life. Not even the pagans are that brash. God's name cannot be invoked except in blasphemy in our public schools, where science is now largely taught as a belief system that accounts for everything in the universe, its origin and order, as well as human destiny and behavior, without reference to God. Media shares this commitment and enlarges upon it by ridiculing Christian norms and picturing Christians as intolerant fanatics. At the same time, and with great irony, study after scientific study shows that Americans who attend church regularly and practice their faith fare much better than those who don't in every category of physical and mental ailment and social dysfunction, including alcohol and drug abuse, crime and recidivism, depression and stress, suicide, family stability, marital and sexual satisfaction, and physical health. Not even our much vaunted science persuades us to let God back into the public square. Child, I found it hard to believe the story about Moses and the 12 plagues of Egypt. It wasn't the 12 plagues I doubted. I had no trouble believing them. But it was the persistent hardening of the Pharaoh's heart. It just didn't make sense to me as a boy that after such overwhelming proof, the Pharaoh would continue to act against the evidence and against his and his country's interests. It wasn't until I became a man that I learned to accept political realities. Who's really responsible for this state of affairs? What about the Christians themselves, who have moved like Lot and his family into the city of sin and death? By failing to complete the work of creation in ourselves and our families and our towns, and by allowing that work to be accomplished to the glory of man rather than to the glory of God and in obedience to his precepts, we have consigned our children, as Lot did his, to a world of sin and death. Can we be surprised or blame others in their minds mirror a world without God? A classical Christian education knows well that the mind is a microcosmos, and that the influence of the mind and the world runs both ways. As Christian educators, our task is not only to teach the gospel, but to complete the work of creating the world in the image of God, the Pantocrator. Whether our students are prepared to join the workforce, whether they can read and add and subtract, whether they can throw a football or play a clarinet, these are all secondary. None is essential. In view, there are three essential elements to a classical Christian education. They can be summed up in the three words: purpose, form, and content. The purpose of the education we are speaking about is to teach virtue and to form Christian men and women. It is, as I wrote in Norms and Nobility, to teach the young to know what is good, to serve it above self, to reproduce it, and to recognize that in their knowledge lies this responsibility. This involves studying the world as God created it, and helping students see themselves not only as creatures of God, but as new creations in Christ, charged with the responsibility for completing the creation of the world in the image of God. The form of a classical Christian education is the trivium: grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the essential paradigm for acquiring all knowledge. Every subject, as Ed Vieth and Andrew Kern lucidly reveal in their book Classical Education, has its own grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And the way to master any subject is to master its trivium. The learner must acquire information, grammar, grasp it intellectually, logic, and use it purposefully, rhetoric. The trivium integrates the theoretical and the practical, tying together facts, arguments, and real-world applications. Factual knowledge, grammar, is useless without understanding, logic. And knowledge and understanding mean little unless they can be expressed and applied, rhetoric. Form not only provides the key to knowledge, but it fits our purpose, making our students doers of the word and not hearers only. Because it is sometimes controversial and often, I think, misunderstood, I would like to take more time in discussing the content of a classical Christian education. We need to understand what we're about when we marry classical to Christian. Some naively imagine that we're talking about marrying classical educational methods to Christian content. This means, presumably, organizing the educational enterprise around the trivium and quadrivium while using exclusively Christian texts and topics. Approach begs a number of important questions. First, can we hope to understand Christian texts and topics without having explored the pagan thought and belief to which they were responding? Second, is there a peculiarly Christian understanding of the physical universe and human history that is exclusive of or somehow at odds with the theories and observations of the best pre-Christian or non-Christian scholars? Third, is it possible to understand the Christian faith and to internalize it other than dialectically? That is to say, in a learning environment stripped of all doubts or challenges to it. Finally, even if it were possible, is this likely to be the best way to prepare a young person to meet the doubts and challenges he is bound to encounter in a post-Christian age? Christian faith was planted and grew in a pagan soil, not unlike the soil in which ideas germinate today. Our work in education, it seems to me at least, is bedeviled by the fact that many of us have not accepted the post-Christian, indeed anti-Christian nature of our society and of our own precarious position as Christians within it. We have been here before, roughly 2,000 years ago. By day, our society slips back into paganism. It may go by the name of New Age, but it is very, very old. Indeed, that is one of its selling points. It claims to predate Christianity and restore a kind of innocence and purity that existed before John the Baptist came out of the wilderness with locusts on his breath, proclaiming a baptism in token of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. You listen to the modern academy's indictment against your faith? Christianity introduces a false, linear historicism that is responsible for the extinction of whole races and their creeds. Christianity is the enemy of the environment by placing God outside nature and by commanding and empowering man to subdue nature. Christianity universalizes cultural norms and taboos that have no moral ground other than an outdated, error-ridden sacred text. Christianity divides people and breeds intolerance by insisting on the exclusive worship of its one God through his Son, Jesus Christ. That is what is being taught in the universities of this land every day. In its climate of political correctness, these indictments are no less harsh than the accusations of cannibalism and incest leveled against the Christians of an earlier time. One clear advantage of a classical Christian education is the opportunity it gives us to help our children understand the world they live in, the forces that they as Christians are up against, and the dark destiny of New Age beliefs and theories. But we lose this advantage if we reject classical content and refuse to engage it critically and fairly. Another advantage of teaching classical content is the opportunity it gives our students to discover how beautifully and majestically Christianity resolved many of the crises and conundrums of the ancient world. Crises and conundrums that we see in contemporary society increasingly as it slips back into paganism. If we had more time, it would be interesting to examine Christianity's ability to transcend and heal the intractable conflicts between the aristos and hoi polloi, slave and free, Roman and barbarian in the world of that time. Christianity brought all people together. Or we might consider how Christianity preserved the ideal of moral perfection while releasing the individual from a self-defeating egocentrism, an egocentrism that plagued even the best of the pagans. I see how Christianity struggled with the pagan world's tendency to see reason and desire in opposition to each other, and eventually found an honored place for both within the human breast by joining intense desire with sane reasoning in longing for God. Through the study of classical texts and topics, students can see how Christ fulfilled the partial truths embodied in these texts And they can say with Justin, a learned philosopher, martyred in the 2nd century during the reign of so good an emperor as Marcus Aurelius, whatever things are rightly said by any man belongs to us Christians. Whatever things are rightly said by any man belongs to us Christians. I would be remiss, I think, if I did not share this small personal quarrel I have with the phrase classical Christian. It strikes me as redundant and, at least in that sense, a bit pretentious. Christian paideia is shot through with classical ideas. Classical civilization was the soil in which Christianity grew. The first Christians, even among the Jews, were profoundly influenced by Hellenistic ideas. And even so ardent a Jew as Paul, a student of Gamaliel, wrote his letters in Greek and expressed himself in the language of a Greek philosopher. His brilliant speech on the Areopagus in Athens, where the Catholic Pope and Orthodox Metropolitan met this spring, is a case in point. Paul opens this speech, which we read in Acts, by showing some familiarity with the religious observances and beliefs of the Greeks. Men of Athens, I see that in everything that concerns religion, you are uncommonly scrupulous. First pronouncement about God as the creator of everything and the sustainer of all life is consistent, almost, with the high paganism of his day. His teaching sounds very close to the Stoic pantheism of Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus, with this difference. His God seems to stand outside nature and not in it. Paul surely pulls his listeners up short when he affirms that this God created every race of men from one stock. Believing that their ancestors had sprung from the soil of their native Attica, the Athenians prided themselves on their racial superiority. They will not fancy Paul's leveling creed. Paul goes on to say that God not only created all men from one stock, but he placed in them a hunger for himself, which accounts for the religious ferment and scrupulosity of the Greeks. God is very near, but the Greeks are looking for him in the wrong places. Toward this teaching, Paul quotes not from the Torah, a book with which the Greeks were probably unfamiliar, and which in any event lacked authority in their eyes, but he quotes from 2 Greek poets writing about Zeus. First, he quotes from the Cretan poet Epimenides, who lived around the 7th century B.C. From his poem Cretica, spoken by Minos, Zeus's son, about his father. I fashioned a tomb of thee, O holy and high one. The Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. But thou art not dead. Thou livest and abidest forever. For in thee we live and move and have our being. The second quotation comes from the Silesian poet Aratus, living in about the 4th century B.C. It is with Zeus that every one of us is in every way, it is with Zeus that every one of us in every way has to do, for we are also his offspring. This speech over. Paul plagiarizes. He doesn't give these Greek poets credit, but he gave his audience credit. They knew these poets well. They knew the lines I read to you by heart. Paul concludes his address with the good news that God has now fed this spiritual hunger in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ. The slaughtered paschal lamb is risen from the dead. Come to the Eucharistic feast. But even in this conclusion, Paul's message of repentance appeals to Greek sensibilities. It is not their moral guilt, Paul, but their ignorance, for which there is no longer any excuse, that will bring them into condemnation on the day of judgment. Everything Paul has said is consistent with the gospel he has preached in the synagogues throughout Asia Minor, but his argument is rich with pagan allusions and proofs. The theme of his message is the progressive unfolding of God's revelation in time, an unfolding that was not limited to the Hebrew people living in Palestine, but to all Adam's race. Now with Christ, the light has come into the world. Men and women no longer need to live in ignorance and seek God in darkness. Why I say classical Christian seems redundant to me, as it would be to say Hebrew Christian. Christian embraces both these modifiers and grows out of them. It is as false as the distinction between secular and sacred that has had a lot to do with our failure to finish the creation as God commanded us to do. Christ is the Lord of all life, or he is no better than the gods of the Greeks, confined to their shrines and temples and sacred precincts, and to the private places. I wish that we as Christians were more inclined, as Paul was, to follow this precept of Marcus Aurelius. Nature equips rational beings with the same powers as herself. The microcosm in that one phrase, share the logos of nature. We have the powers. It says nature works on whatever opposes or resists her, giving it a place in the necessary order and making it part of herself. So too can a rational being convert every hindrance into material for himself and use it for his own ends. This nature works on whatever opposes or resists her, giving it a place in the necessary order and making it part of herself. So too can you and I convert every hindrance into material for ourselves and use it for our own ends. All true as we Christians believe. To possess even more confidence than this Stoic emperor in our God-given, Spirit-driven abilities to convert the content of classical civilization, as the Apostle Paul did, into material for teaching the gospel and creating the world in the image of God. The Spartan lawgiver, Lycurgus, would not allow the Spartans to build a wall around their city. He knew that if they did this, they would become weak inside that wall, and eventually their wall would be breached and they would succumb to the enemies all around them. Instead, Lycurgus' laws set up an extraordinary regimen of paideia, which trained and a Christian paideia, so robust, so comprehensive, that they do not need to be walled off from the world, but can enter the world with the fearless confidence of well-trained and hardened warriors, secure in the knowledge that their God has overcome the world and that they can convert every hindrance into materials, not for their own ends, but for the sake of Christ. Do we have some time for some questions, Ed? Okay. Do you have any questions or any comments? Would you like to argue with some of what I've said? I would welcome that. I won't defend it. I'd just like to hear another point of view. Yes, sir. Well, I think it's Orthodox theology, at least in I'm not a Lutheran, so I can't speak to Lutherans, but to identify two great commissions which we have received as creatures of God and new creations in Christ. Most Christians, I think, are quite familiar with the second commission, which is to go to the ends of the world preaching the gospel. But what I tried to argue in my paper is that we received the first commission as being creatures of God, and that was the commission to fish, multiply, subdue the earth. And I interpret that to mean that God, when he created man, he hadn't completed it. He didn't put us into a static point. He hadn't named all the creatures. He hadn't set everything up. We weren't a bunch of automatons. He had created us free, creative. He created this intelligent, creative being that he gave a mind to. But most importantly, he gave freedom to. That was the whole point of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was the essence of our freedom. And he said to man, use your freedom. Use your freedom to complete my creation. And my argument in my paper is that if you read the Genesis account, that command was made before Adam and Eve sinned. And it was to be expected or to assumed in such a command that we were going to complete that creation in obedience to God and his precepts. We were going to create, we were going to do that in obedience to him. and in relationship with him, because he came and walked with us in the cool of the day every day. We'd be chatting with him on a daily basis about, what am I going to do with the antelope over there, Lord? We lost that relationship. It didn't change our freedom, our creativity, our empowerment to do something. And unfortunately, I read, too, the indictment, the list of things that the Academy indicts the Christian church for. And I've lived most of my life in the Academy. I mean, one foot in the Academy, one foot in the Christian church. Most Christians have the luxury of sort of retreating from the front lines of the culture wars going on right now. In most of the major academies, the war is over, and we've lost. And one of the attacks that was made on us in the 60s and 70s and is largely accepted as truth at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, is that Christian theology, it's that book we regard as a sacred text, is responsible for the disaster we see all around us environmentally, because it empowered man to go out and do whatever he wanted to do to nature. Wouldn't it have been better if we had been pantheists and seen ourselves as a part of nature, and therefore not been so hard on nature? Worship the cows rather than slaughter them. Wouldn't that have been better? That's the argument. That's where the New Age is coming from. And I think it's important that we as Christians have a handle on because this is used against us all the time. This, subdue the earth, this quotation. And I think it's important we have a handle theologically on when that command was given, why it was given, how appropriate it is. And the reality is that I feel it was quite powerfully and strongly that Christians, we have gotten all excited about the Second Commission. Many of us have now forgotten that as well. But we've lost sight of the First Commission, and that is to finish the good creation God started on our behalf, and to finish that creation in accordance with His precepts and in relationship with Him. Yes? I don't have a denomination, and I don't know the phrase. I don't know the phrase bondage of the will. I think you're talking about some Augustinian idea. Yes. Well, the question, as I understand it, is what will be the effects of this classical or this Christian paideia on our students as they engage the world? Is that a fair way of rephrasing it? Well, I think what my hope would be that student is so educated and having come up through the system of an application of the trivium to all these hordes of knowledge will take what he or she has learned into the town hall, into the neighborhood association, whatever it is. I mean, when it's a decision about whether to build a building or not to build a building, or redesign this or not, to change a law or not to change a law, it will be a decision that will be informed historically and through Scripture. I mean, through a whole process of understanding that they have a responsibility here. Their responsibility is to act in response to this commission of God to finish the good creation, and they cannot retreat from that responsibility, and they cannot assume that the proposal on the table, which is coming from non-Christian sources, is the correct proposal. They need to look at it critically in light of their own faith and their own beliefs. Whether it's a theory, whether it's from a Lutheran point of view or an Orthodox point of view or a Catholic point of view, that's largely irrelevant to me. And I know that's probably not the right thing to say here. But I'm more interested I was very engaged in the first speaker's talk about the Lutheran contributions, and I think his last point was a really interesting one to me. It really provoked me to think. But I'm much more focused personally on, I guess, what we call mere Christianity. I'm very interested in finding common ground with all of my brothers and sisters, and I believe very strongly, more strongly in perhaps some of the Lutheran doctrines in, say, the 12th chapter of 1 Corinthians, that we are all part of one body, and that we can't lose sight of the fact that it is Christ's body we're talking about. And we may have different gifts, may be different parts, but it's Christ's body that brings us all together.
One more, maybe Pastor Hine, and then we'll need to close this.
Well, if you're hearing things that sound a little different from what you're used to hearing, or a little maybe hetero-orthodox in relation to a Lutheran creed, I'd say that's good for both of us, because it may stimulate you to sort of, firm up your own grounds for belief, and it's certainly good for me because it stimulates me to think about things a little differently. But where I would enter the discussion would be in that last phrase you used, and I was so delighted to hear you use it because I was waiting through the whole comment to get there. Christ's work of redemption isn't just for us, it's for the world. And that's how I understand it. That nature did groan, and we were responsible. Through one man, sin came into the world. Through one man, the world is relieved of the burden of sin. Now, the earth didn't turn perfect after the resurrection any more than man turned perfect after the resurrection. That's how I understand it. But we now have, through Christ and His Spirit, a no longer an excuse for working in the dark. And we now have, through that power, through the resurrection, the power to come to God. He's given us that. That's His gift. And I think that also changes the role we have in relation to the world. And when I say the world, what I mean is I think we have the power in Christ to make a difference in our world. The world has been redeemed too, and we share that redemption with the world. Is that, I don't know if that's connecting with the comment you were making, but I don't see the world. The world is fallen, and we are fallen. The world is redeemed, and we are redeemed through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Things changed after Christ. Well, I'd have to look at that again, but my feeling would be that in relation to the whole work of Christ's redemptive work, that we stand in the same relationship with the world, and that we're no better off than the world, but we're much better off than we were before His resurrection. Does that? And I think here, perhaps, and I'll conclude with this, Ed, maybe this is an area in which Christians need to talk more specifically in terms of the effects of the redemption of Christ's death and resurrection on the world, on nature. Because I think our failure to do that, I'm not speaking of anyone in this room, but as a group, the Christian Church's failure to have a theology of ecology or a theology of nature, I think it's led us as Christian individuals and as Christian institutions to make mistakes in relation to the creation and not to complete our work. One of the points that I'm trying to make with regard to these prisoners, by the way, is that these are men. I don't know how many of you teach in the prison. Now, they all belong there. They've all done terrible things. Or not all, but many of them have done terrible things. But there are many believing Christian men and women outside of prison who are doing terrible things. And when I work with these men, it baffles me. It confuses me. Now, I know all the theological reasons. I know that they're fallen men and that, except for the grace of God. But where is the grace of God then? I think we've stopped short, especially in my part of the country where you have a lot of salvation preaching. And that salvation preaching, it seems to me, plays right into a weakness of our society, which was also a pagan weakness, which is pointed out in the first talk here, a lot of egocentrism. This whole thing is about me. Christ died for me, and I'm going to get saved. And the whole purpose of His dying was so that I can feel better. I can have my sins taken away from me. And I think we fail to say that's the beginning. That we have a responsibility in relation to what God has done for us. And I think that responsibility is twofold. One is it's to take His good news to the ends of the earth, to all of those around us, to everyone in our neighborhood. And secondly, it is to complete the creation that He entrusted to us and complete it in the way He intended. Thank you, Ed. Thanks.